Game 2 on tap, and changes coming in Big D. Welcome to NHL Wraparound Stanley Cupdate for Friday, June 6, 2025. Vic Morren, Neil Smith, and changes coming in Dallas.
General Manager Jim Nill announced that Pete DeBoer has been relieved of his head coaching duties and that a search for his successor will begin immediately. Peter DeBoer had 1 year to go on his contract.
You surprised?
Very surprised. Very surprised. I didn't see this coming at all. I will give my partner credit. He did mention that this could happen because Peter DeBoer has a history of not going right to the very end. He's got a good history of making the playoffs, got a good history of winning rounds, but not winning the big rounds. And you said that. And at the time, I think I probably, like I do with most things you say, I poo-pooed it. Said that wasn't going to happen. I should listen to Dr. Vic. But yeah, Peter DeBoer is a good coach. Yes, he hasn't won the Stanley Cup. Yes, his teams couldn't get by that round. But I'm wondering also, Vic, if Jim Nill felt the same way that we felt, which was when he pulled Ottinger in that game, that clinching game. Don't you think he was saying WTF the way we were saying it?
I think when Ottinger did not come back in, I thought that said an awful lot, that things may be frayed there. And when they couldn't push this thing, the handwriting was kind of on the wall here. You could see when a team just appears to go as far as they could go. And you mentioned he's made the Cup final twice, once with Jersey, once with San Jose. But he lost the conference final 5 out of 6 years. And that goes back to his time in Vegas. And you reach a point where I think from Nill's perspective, you have to say, okay, I'm not certain that we can really get any further with this leadership behind our bench. And now it's time for a change. And the question is, what type of head coach does Dallas look for to take that next step? Because they are certainly among the elite teams in the NHL. Mikko Rantanen will now have a full season with this club. So where do they go next? If you're a GM, if you're Jim Nill, where are you going? Who are you looking
for? Okay, let me tell you who right now is scratching their heads, collective heads around the NHL. That would be people, for example, like David Quinn, who just took the Rangers assistant coaching job and the next day finds out that a head coaching job is available. A general manager who hired a head coach already, to wake up this morning and find out that Peter DeBoer is available. And I went with X. Those guys got to be scratching their heads. Now, not everybody has the intestinal fortitude that Doug Armstrong has, that when a good coach becomes available, he immediately fires his coach and hires that coach, like he did with Drew Bannister and Jim Montgomery, which paid huge dividends with the way that St. Louis finished their season. But this throws a monkey wrench into all that job market, right? Peter DeBoer is out there and available. Now, who could his replacement be? Well, it won't be a rookie. I don't think it's going to be a first-time coach going in to coach this team in Dallas that thinks that they're on the doorstep of the Stanley Cup.
No, this team is close.
Right. So is it Gerard Gallant type person who's out there? Now, one could say, well, Jerry Gallant hasn't had much success when it comes right down to it. Well, he did lead a first-year team in the NHL all the way to the final in the first year.
And it was an unbelievable coaching job that he did with that club.
Yeah, so, maybe he's a candidate. Maybe Jim Nill already knows who he wants that's out there. But what veteran coaches that are out there? Like, and we don't have anything written down, obviously. This just happened. So, what other guys? Peter Laviolette, he's won the Stanley Cup. He's a veteran coach. He gets a lot out of his players, especially the first year. What other guys are out there?
I would just tell you that when Torts was working with ESPN and the Philly and the Dallas jobs were both open, I thought Dallas was a really good fit because they were close. Philly wasn't. And Torts got them to a certain point. He made them far more responsible as a team. And obviously now that since they have parted ways, and I still think Dallas is in that same spot where they're on the cusp. And maybe this is something that would be a good fit to get that last final step into the final and perhaps win the Stanley Cup.
So we've mentioned on this show many times that we think that John Tortorella was a unique individual in many ways, but one of the ways he's unique is that he was a coach that we thought needed a veteran team, and he came in to put the finishing touches on it. But he took Philadelphia, and he did a great job with young players and building that club up to the point where they got to. Of course, he expires like they all do. So which one is he better at? Is he better at the Dallas type of situation where you got to get Mikko Rantanen and his teammates over the hump? Or is he better at a rebuilding team?
Well, let me go back to something that you and I have spoken about before, and that is very few coaches are builders and closers. And of course, he closed with Tampa, albeit it's been 21 years since that happened, but he still has a Stanley Cup ring. And he showed that he could build a team in Philadelphia. The problem is that he really didn't have the personnel to get this team further than they were able to get.
Right. There's not many coaches out there that can be both Rivera and the starter as well. They don't come onto the mound in the first inning and they can come on to close the game out. Just a little bit of an analogy. It'll be interesting to see where Jim Nill goes with this. You know, Vic, the league isn't fair, right? It's a results-driven business, and it's not fair. It's not fair what happened with Peter DeBoer in a lot of different places, but they keep moving on. And I got to tell you, and I don't know Pete really well. I know him a little bit. And good enough to, by the way, to try to get him to come on NHL Wraparound. In situations like this, I always feel bad because I remember when Paul Maurice got the job in Florida only 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. Horrible articles were written about why would they go and get this boring guy to come in and coach Florida when they're this good and it could be an exciting team. Well, now we've forgotten that because Paul Maurice is in his third straight final.
Yeah.
And we think of him as one of the best coaches, not only this year, but of all time.
Yeah.
But 3 years ago, when he left Winnipeg, people didn't want him coming to their team. So that's why I feel bad for Peter DeBoer. Has he just not had the right personnel to get him there? We really don't know that. We really don't know, is it him or is it the personnel?
That was a pretty good team in Dallas. And what we saw this past spring is what we have seen in recent springs there. And I think it's got to fall on the coach at some point. I mean, obviously it's the players also, but you look for that guy that can take you to that next place, and he just wasn't able to do it. But he will resurface because they all do.
How many teams has he been with now? Do we know? I don't know which his first team was. I got to look it up. I'll have that by the end of the show. How about that?
All right. Well, let's move forward then. Game 2, Friday evening. Panthers and Oilers, 8 o'clock Eastern on TNT. And the Panthers looking to even up the series after dropping Game 1 in overtime on a power play goal by Leon Draisaitl. We've often talked about adjustments, more adjustments. Teams have had a day off. And I think both of us believe that both teams have to be better than they were in the first game.
Well, there's going to be adjustments on both sides. That's for sure. Not this time. It's not just going to be on the loser's side that they adjust. They're going to adjust because it's the first time in 32 times, first and only time. They're now 31-1 in taking a lead into any intermission and losing the game. So they're going to adjust in that regard. They're going to hammer down how to protect the lead, get the lead. They're going to hammer down on trying to keep McDavid and Draisaitl at bay. And on the other end, Edmonton's going to come out and say, we've got to not only score the first goal, but keep that momentum going. Don't let them take the momentum away from us the way they did in Game 1.
I thought a significant part to this was Edmonton's complete willingness to engage with Florida on a physical level with a lot of big hits, a couple of goals coming because of good board work, particularly the first one. And that was scored by Draisaitl as well because he bookended the game, scoring the first and last goal for the Oilers. But that first goal was hard work. And I believe that the continued engagement to play down below the goal line is going to be a key for Edmonton because I don't believe that Florida is going to allow this series to become a track meet. Because even though Florida can succeed in open ice, their game is the jam. It's the sandpaper. It's play the game along the wall. And as I said at the outset, I believe that the success of the Oilers over the course of this series is going to be their continued willingness to play that game, get in the faces of the Panthers, and try to beat them at their own game. Because I don't think it works vice versa.
Totally agree with you. And I don't know what more I could add to that because that's the way the Panthers have got to play. They cannot allow Edmonton to play their game and dictate the pace of the game. They're going to have to dictate the way the game goes, and they're going to have to dictate it without taking too many penalties because, as we know, even though Edmonton's power play hasn't been as good as it had been last year, it's still got the same personnel out there that could do a lot of damage.
Have you ever come across a team that is identified with one style of play? And the Oilers, of course, rushes, creativity, speed. But when they're challenged with having to play a different style, a Florida style, a jam style, play that 50-50 puck battles are going to determine things. And they turn out relishing that they're able to play in a different way. Have you ever come across a club like that?
No, I mean they're very unique in that they can, they can go whatever way you want to go. Yeah, I don't remember watching too many teams over the years that were as good as they are at that.
Well, so far, because on the flip side, Florida's going to try the exact same thing. That, yes, they could score in open ice. They did score a goal off the rush in game one, but I expect them to be heavier in the Edmonton zone, force those Oiler forwards to come back and support the defense, and that layering that Craig Button talked about in our Stanley Cup final preview, I believe you'll see more of that. And I think you're going to see it executed better than we saw in game one. Because second period, it was great for the Panthers. They completely flipped the script, and then it got away from them in the third period.
Right, and that's what they'll concentrate on, and that's what they'll ask themselves, what went wrong? This is the coaching staff, and the coaching staff will take that answer to the players and do the corrective work that they need to do. Before we go on, do you want the answer to the Pete DeBoer coaching question?
That's why we're here.
Pete DeBoer has a very extensive coaching background. It started in 94-95 with the Detroit Junior Red Wings, and he coached in junior in the OHL right through 07-08 when he joined the Florida Panthers as head coach and stayed there for 3 non-playoff seasons, then went to New Jersey, and in his first year lost in the final.
Yeah, to the Kings in 2012.
Yeah, and the next 2 seasons they were out of the playoffs, and then in his third season he was let go mid-season. The very next season after that, he went to the San Jose Sharks and had 5 seasons, 4 full seasons and part of a 5th, and was let go in the middle of the 5th season with San Jose and gobbled up right away by Vegas, who fired Gerard Gallant to hire Pete DeBoer. Sort of the Doug Armstrong move that I spoke about earlier.
Yeah.
He finished that season with 22 games, lost in round 3. Then the next season with Vegas, lost in round 3. And then the next season missed the playoffs.
Yep.
And then he was hired right away after that season to be the coach of the Dallas Stars. all 3 seasons he lost in the conference final. So that's a coaching career of 5 teams now. He's been the head coach in the league. And here's the interesting part that I'm jealous of. Never missed a season between 2008 and 2025, has not been out of the chair for a full year.
This is going to be a tough one now because the only opening is the team that is now vacated.
And I don't think they'll hire him. Do you?
No.
And by the way, he won Coach of the Year twice in the OHL.
Maybe a season in TV, and then he gets back in. The resume is good.
It's excellent. Vic, talking about the final, both TNT and Sportsnet/CBC in Canada both used artificial intelligence to do some marvelous opens. I thought they were marvelous opens anyways for the Stanley Cup final series.
I believe the TNT Open was more marvelous than the reception that Sportsnet and CBC got for something that they had posted on social media. So if folks haven't seen it, the TNT Open had a recreation of Lord Stanley presenting his bowl, which eventually became the Stanley Cup, and the first recipients were the Montreal AAA in 1893. And what they did was they actually took photos of 3 teams within this Open to kind of bridge the history of past and present. So they had the Montreal AAA, the Ottawa Silver 7 of 1905, and the New York Rangers from 1933. And they colorized these photos, and then they brought the athletes to life, standing, smiling. And back in the day, you never saw people smiling in photos because of the time of the exposure that it took for the cameras to actually develop the photo. So that's why you see everybody with pursed lips by and large, because it was easier to hold that expression on a face than it was a smile. But to see these athletes get up off of their seats and smile, Frank McGee, who is legendary in Stanley Cup lore from 120 years ago, to see him smile, to see Frank Calder and Ching Johnson of the Rangers in 1933. I thought that was terrific. It was not met with universal approval. Some people thought it was tacky. I thought it was really well executed, though.
I did too. I enjoyed it. But there again, look who we're talking about. You and me that love history, love the history of the game. We'd love to go back into a time warp and be there when these things happened so that we could talk about it even more. Very interesting. When Frank Calder was handing the Stanley Cup to that group of Rangers on the ice, that wasn't the official Stanley Cup presentation. I believe, because I've looked at the history, that was done on opening night of the next season, because the Rangers won that Stanley Cup in Toronto. They never won a Stanley Cup in New York ever until 1994. So
who's that GM?
Some guy, I don't know. He just got lucky. Anyway, I thought it was terrific what TNT did. Really enjoyed it, and the NHL and TNT have done some really good stuff this year. I mean, I got to say, I really enjoyed the ad that the NHL put together for tipping when Marchand was at the end and said, and he tipped $63, and he says, "I love tipping." He was at that point, he was the Boston captain,
correct?
And by the way, Ottinger was in that thing. He didn't know he'd get pulled.
No,
most important game. Jacob Markstrom was there, and I'm sure he had high hopes of going further than he went.
Yeah,
and Soros was also in that commercial. And anyway, it was neat to see the goaltenders without their masks on.
I just wanted to put a wrap on the TNT stuff because I think contextually, if you take the wholeness of it, which was the way teams celebrate now and the joy that's on their faces. And I think to a large degree, that was part of trying to bring those images to life, was that since the first awarding of the Stanley Cup in 1893, that there is still joy that carries on to today. And I believe that that was the greater message in colorizing and animating.
Just so that everybody out there that's listening knows these facts, the Stanley Cup was a challenge cup. It was not a playoff formatted trophy.
Correct.
It was a challenge cup. So the first winner was Montreal AAA. They held the Stanley Cup until they were challenged the next year, by the end of the year, by the winner of the other side of the country, usually the western side, and they would challenge them for the Stanley Cup. That's where you get those famous stories of the dog sledding, going across the country to challenge for the Stanley Cup. Some great stories, but it was not at all what we see today. So when the Ottawa Silver Seven won it, it wasn't like it came down to the Stanley Cup final and da-da-da. Now,
right.
by the
it
time
was a
the
challenge
Rangers...
from Dawson City up in the Yukon, that
Right.
the legend has it that the team traveled by dog sled and boat and train and every other means of transportation available just to get their asses kicked.
Yes. And they ended up feeling like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest.
Well, that's where the legend of Frank McGee came from, in the second game of that 2-game set where they won, I think it was 21-2. And
Goodness
McGee scored
gracious.
like 14
Wow.
goals or something like that. So
Anyway.
Because I want to get to the Sportsnet piece of this before we move on to the state of the NHL. And essentially what they did was, this was released on social media, and they generated kids to resemble Ron McLean, Kelly Rudy, Kevin Bieksa, and Elliot Friedman on their main panel. And this thing just got panned. Longtime commentator Keith Olbermann said, just stop with this crap. And when you go and you look at some of the comments from people, and one cracked me up here. He said, this was a spectacularly bad idea, which managed to be even worse in its execution. And I think at one point even Friedman kind of clears his throat, hacks a loogie or something like that. And it was something that they tried. It was different. But when you're going into game one of the Stanley Cup final, I think you got to be a little bit more genuine than what this display was.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm Canadian. That was a Canadian idea. So I got to live with it. I got to promote my countrymen. They tried and they failed.
You're a Canadian. It was your idea to do this podcast with me. So I don't know where you take that.
We're not going to try and fail at this, though.
All right. State of the NHL. So prior to game one, Commissioner Bettman always sits down, has a press conference, delivers on various topics, and we're going to go through a few of them here. First of all, no succession plan for the commissioner, as perhaps has been put out there by some, but he said, sorry to disappoint, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon.
Gary's been there a long time, since 1992-93, and presented the Montreal Canadiens with their Stanley Cup that year. We'll see. You never know, right? Gary's his own man. He'll do what he wants to do. It's sort of like the Commissioner Lamoriello. He walks to the beat of his own drum.
Well, the truth is that the league revenues and the visibility has never been better, and a lot of that has come under his stewardship.
No, you can't take any credit away from him for anything. He has been there during a marvelous time for the owners, just a marvelous time. And franchise values are at an all-time high. And players' salaries are at an all-time high.
Yeah, I mean, he's had his detractors, as often happens, and I still think that the affection of trying to keep that team in Arizona for that long is probably one of those X marks. But the bottom line is that the league has flourished and they are clearly identified with him and the job that he has done. So with that, let's move to the new CBA, which, well, it's not new yet because there is no agreement in place, but talks constructive and in really good shape. And the current CBA was signed in 2013 with a 4-year extension ratified in 2020. And that ratification took place because of COVID. And then there was the escrow that had to be put in there because there was no assurance of what future revenues were going to look like coming out of the pandemic. The current CBA expires September 15th of 2026, but obviously Bettman and NHLPA Director Marty Walsh getting way ahead of this. And I think there's something you got to like about the working relationship of these two in comparison to those that had preceded Walsh in there. And that goes all the way back to Bob Goodnow, who was in that position when Bettman took over his role in the early 90s.
Yeah, and I had a chance to sit down and talk with Marty Walsh at UBS Arena. And really nice guy, former mayor of Boston. He talked about a number of different things, but most importantly, he wants to come on NHL Wraparound. And so he will be on here at some time in the future, and we'll just leave you with that.
Tax-free states. The sentiment here is that this is being blown out of proportion. This is a topic that you and I have spoken about also. And a lot of teams are crying foul because the state of Florida has been represented from the Eastern Conference in the last 6 Stanley Cup finals. The Tampa Bay Lightning, the 3 years preceding what the Panthers have represented for the East right now. The Vegas Golden Knights have been to 2 Stanley Cup finals, winning one of them. There are 6 teams in the NHL that currently play in tax-free states, and that's Florida, Tampa, Dallas, Nashville, Vegas, and Seattle. And when we talk about tax-free, it's obviously state income tax, not federal. And the feeling here is nobody was complaining when the Blackhawks had their run or the Kings won twice in a 3-year span earlier in the last decade. What I find interesting here is that there has still been no sort of schedule to account for this, and conveniently left out here were the Canadian teams, which is an entirely different animal because of their tax structure. So while we were talking about tax-free states, there's 7 teams north of the border that are at a further perceivable disadvantage than the clubs that do have state income tax in the U.S.
I don't buy this gripe at all. At all. I mean, the worst place, the highest tax rate you can have in the United States is living in Manhattan. Okay? You get New York City tax, New York state tax, and federal tax. And yet, I don't see Panarin turning down going to the Rangers, and I don't see other people. They always are able to come up with some good free agents. The only way that this argument holds any water to me is if the Florida Panthers have had this success over the last 3 seasons because of free agents that decided to go to Florida. Okay, that they signed on with Florida because you could make the argument, well, they did that because of the no state income tax. Same
what about
thing
the
with
weather also?
Well, yeah, but we're not talking about the weather. I mean, how much success is Nashville Predators getting out of their tax-free state, and how much success is Seattle getting out of their tax-free state of Washington? Not much.
No, and it's fair to make that point also, is that there is always a counter to the success. And one of the things that we should not ignore is the work that Julien Brisebois and Bill Zito have done over these past 6 years with the Lightning and the Panthers.
And Steve Yzerman for Tampa Bay before he left for Detroit.
Correct. Yep.
That in growing that franchise. And the other thing is, go back further and look at how bad Tampa Bay and Florida were at one time. And like the Florida Panthers, to talk about them perhaps winning a Stanley Cup was just nonsense a number of years ago. Nobody would ever believe that Florida Panthers could ever win the Cup. They were horrible for so long. So I don't buy this thing. I don't buy this argument. And Canadian teams have always been at a disadvantage because of the currency exchange. All players in the NHL get paid in U.S. funds. All contracts are in U.S. funds. Canadian teams are at a 30% disadvantage right there.
Yep.
I still see that Nazem Kadri decided to go from Colorado to Calgary. You still see that players have signed on with Edmonton. You still see that players are signed on with Toronto Maple Leafs. Ekman Larsson left Florida, the tax-free state, to go to tax hell in Toronto, Ontario. Yeah. So there can be arguments made both ways on this, but it's really convenient to say, here's why they're so good. They're so good because they don't have state income tax. It's not because our team hasn't done as good a job. We've done every bit as good a job, but they're just better than us because they don't have state income tax. No, it's not true. It's Zito and, as you said, Julien Brisebois that have done a great job. By the way, as has some of the other teams that lost out in the rounds this year, as we've talked about on the show. Clearly, Edmonton and Florida are above the rest. But, you know, John Cooper and Julien Brisebois continue to do a marvelous job in Tampa. I still think that Jim Nill and Peter DeBoer did a marvelous job in Dallas up until today. And, George McPhee and Kelly McCrimmon and their coach, Bruce Cassidy, have done a great job in Vegas, keeping them competitive every year. You can't quite say that for Nashville this year. Unfortunately, Barry Trotz's first season as GM didn't work out so well. And in Seattle, I don't know what you got there. You got an up and down. But anyway, that's a long diatribe about tax-free states.
Just promise me you're not going to use that voice for the rest of this show.
Which voice is that?
Yeah, that's the one. A couple of other things. In terms of rules, nothing new on the horizon, such as play-in rounds. Thank God for that, because it just works wonders in the NBA. Eye roll. Penalty jailbreaks. Remember that there was a move to allow players to get out of the penalty box if their team scored a shorthanded goal. That doesn't look like it's happening. Nor expanded overtime, which I think I would have liked to have seen go maybe another couple of minutes.
I would love that too. I'd love anything that gets rid of the shootout.
Amen to that. An update on the All-Star events coming up in 2026 and 2027. Both are going to be held at UBS Arena. You remember that the All-Star game was supposed to be held in early 2026. That is now going to be somewhat of a kickoff event at UBS Arena in advance of the Olympics in Milan. And in 2027, there will be more of an all-star type style event at the arena. So back-to-back years, there will be some sort of activity at UBS Arena.
Which is in Nassau County, New York, in Belmont Park.
You ever been there?
A couple times. How about you?
Yeah.
Anything new on the entry draft?
Yes. After this season, it's going to be up to the teams to go back to the centralized format. Remember, last year, 2024, the event was a marvelous success at the Sphere in Vegas. This year, it is a decentralized draft where players, media, fans will congregate at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles, but the teams will remain at their headquarters to announce their picks. However, given the success of a year ago, it's going to be up to the teams going forward to decide if they want to congregate together in one place as they've done so many years in the past.
And I'll bet you anything, if it's up to the GMs, they're going to go back to in-person drafts, because that's the only time, the one and only time you get to see everybody from all the teams And the hockey world is a small world, no matter how many teams are in the league. And it's really an enjoyable experience. We'll see. Anyway, but that's my bet.
And perhaps we may see the award ceremony and maybe the start of free agency all in the same area, which would certainly make it a real true NHL event on a much larger scale.
Now, I want to ask you, is there any update on the 2026 Olympics that we mentioned earlier and with that kickoff event? I mean, I know Russians aren't going, are they?
They are not. They are still prohibited from participating per the IIHF and the IOC for the Russian participation in the war with Ukraine. So they are out. The agreement for NHL players to go has not been signed yet, just dotting some I's and crossing some T's, but that is certainly going to happen.
Now, please, tell me there's not going to be any more teams in the league.
There will eventually. I think we know that this is where it's heading. However, no formal process has begun, but there are certainly suitors in various markets that are interested in bringing NHL hockey to their respective cities, including Houston and Atlanta, that would be getting their third kick at the can.
Yeah, and Atlanta, well, if they get a third kick at the can, they better get owners like Seattle and Vegas has, not the kind of owners they've had in the last two attempts at NHL hockey.
You know, in the first expansion in 1967, the entry fee was $2 million. And when Seattle went in, I believe it was $650 million.
And was it $2 million per club? I thought
$2 million
it was
per team. Yep.
Okay.
And even though we'll still be doing it this day in Stanley Cup history, this day in league history, 58 years ago today, June 6th, 1967, the first ever expansion draft was held at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. You know who that first pick was?
I should. It's not coming to my head quick enough.
They were all goaltenders in that first round.
Okay.
The Kings had the first pick.
And they took Rogie Vachon.
They took Terry Sawchuk.
Okay, Terry Sawchuk, I remember that. But then how did Rogie Vachon get from the Canadiens to the Kings?
It was a trade, correct?
I think it was, and my memory serves me right. I think what happened was Rogie Vachon was not happy that he had been displaced by Ken Dryden. He asked the Montreal Canadiens to trade him to a team where he could be a starter, and he ended up being traded to the Kings at that time for Dennis DeJordy and three other players. And he went on to have a great career with the Kings. In fact, becoming GM, that's how I know Rogie, because I made trades with him, including Bernie Nichols' trade. But he actually was team MVP of the Kings 4 times and a runner-up for the Vezina one year.
And built really his Hall of Fame career in Los Angeles.
Oh, absolutely, where his number hangs in the rafters.
Let's move over to some other news around the NHL, and 2 teams filling out the rest of their benches with assistant coaches, the Rangers and the Canucks. Canucks calling on Kevin Dean to work on the penalty killing, Brett McLean on the power play, and Scott Young will kind of be a jacks of all trades, assisting Adam Foote in Vancouver. Young won Stanley Cups in Pittsburgh in 91 and Colorado in 1996. And the Rangers bring back David Quinn. He was the head coach from 2018 to 2021. He'll be back in New York, as will Joe Sacco, who leaves the Boston Bruins after being the interim coach to finish out the season this past year, and Ty Hennis, who was an assistant from Mike Sullivan in Pittsburgh, so now he re-ups with him at Madison Square Garden.
Interesting little question for you. The current GM of the Rangers is Chris Drury. Wasn't he the one that fired David Quinn?
That'd be correct.
Interesting bedfellows. David Quinn going back to work under Chris Drury.
That is an outstanding point. But when you're looking for work and you've got a history with the head coach, perhaps now it works.
So the Rhode Island native goes back to the Rangers. And you know what it's time for?
No, tell me.
This day in Stanley Cup history.
All right, and here we go. On this date, June 6, 2007, the Anaheim Ducks win their first and only Stanley Cup in franchise history, defeating the Ottawa Senators 6-2. Scott Niedermayer, the Conn Smythe Trophy winner. This was the first time a team from the West Coast had won the Stanley Cup since the Victoria Cougars in 1925, who were part of the Western Canadian Hockey League. They were the last non-NHL team to win the Stanley Cup because back in those days, the Stanley Cup was determined where the NHL champion would play against the Western Canadian Hockey League / Pacific Coast Hockey Association winner. So that's how Stanley Cup was determined back then. And do you know who the coach of the Victoria Cougars was in 1925, 100 years ago?
No, but I'm sure you were at the games.
Oh, I certainly was. Well, it was somebody that is actually connected to you through the title with the New York Rangers.
Lester Patrick.
That is correct. And just going back to that 2007 final, stud on that club for the Ducks, Corey Perry, had 15 points, 37 penalty minutes in the playoffs, 2 goals, 4 assists in the final, including the last goal of the game to put the final touches on that Stanley Cup championship. And of course, here he is, 18 years later, playing for the Stanley Cup again with the Edmonton Oilers.
Yeah, it's amazing. Been an amazing hockey player. And as I said, the way that I see Corey Perry is in amazement that he could go from being that player, the key guy to the Stanley Cup champion Anaheim Ducks, to now being okay with playing wherever they need him to play, whether that's fourth line, whether that's third line, first line, or just the power plays. He's adapted to whatever role people want him to play at 40 years of age. Who knows? He might be only 3 wins away from a Stanley Cup again.
And is already committed to playing next season. Depends who's going to want him. He's an unrestricted free agent. But you certainly cannot underestimate the value that he is going to have for some team out there.
Absolutely. And I would say that it's going to be a good team, a contending team. I don't think Corey Perry's built to be on a rebuilding team.
And why would he be at this point?
Right.
That'll wrap up our show for today. Neil and I will return on Saturday with a recap of Game 2 of the Oilers-Panthers Stanley Cup Final. So until then, have a great day, and we'll speak to you Saturday.